Okay, shall we get going? Yeah, cool. All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. So my name's Timothy. You can call me Tim. I'm from the University of Cape Town. I'm a final year PhD student there, and I'll be presenting some joint work today with my supervisor, Professor Haroon Borat, also at the University of Cape Town, on the effect of the pandemic on wages and wage inequality in South Africa. I was very happy yesterday to see one other COVID-related paper. And why I was happy was just because it makes me feel like my paper still holds at least a little bit of relevance today. I know that surge of COVID-related papers is now a little bit behind us, thank goodness. But yeah, it doesn't present good prospects for journal submissions, so that was a good sign. So thanks for coming. Hopefully this isn't too much of a blast into the past, more of a useful retrospective outlook. So jumping right in, just to provide some context, during the pandemic, pretty much in every country around the world with measurable wage data, the pandemic introduced a series of really weird and unusual complications into how we interpret changes in the wage distribution over time. This is specifically because of pandemic-specific phenomena, like remote work policies and essential worker policies and the distributions thereof, etc. But basically, these can be somewhat summarized, at least I argue, into two broad factors. The first is composition effects, and that is somewhat self-explanatory, but it just speaks to how the distribution of job loss influenced the aggregate wage distribution and measures in the distribution such as averages or medians. And then, of course, structure effects. There are a number of very plausible mechanisms and hypotheses which may have changed the predictors or the determinants or the returns to wages across the world for a variety of reasons that I won't go into here just for the sake of time. But hence, the implications for how the pandemic affected the distribution of wages, given these dynamics, were ex ante unclear. Particularly in the context of South Africa. For those of you who are unfamiliar, but it is a pretty stark headline that characterizes the country. South Africa is the most income unequal country in the world, measurably with a Gini coefficient or per capita household income of roughly 0.65, as per the latest data. And what drives this aggregate household income inequality is the labor market, inequality within the labor market. This is both because of mass unemployment. We also have amongst the highest unemployment rates in the world, currently by the narrow definition about 33%, the broad definition above 40%. And in addition to a large amount of equivalent zero wage earners, we also have amongst those who do have jobs an extremely skewed wage distribution. There are about 2 or 3 studies which seek to decompose the relative contributions of these two factors, and they seem to suggest that even though only marginally, it's the wage distribution among the employed that has a slightly larger impact on aggregate income inequality in South Africa rather than the extreme amount of unemployed in the country. So hence, we argue that understanding the effects of the pandemic on wage inequality in particular amongst workers is critical into understanding aggregate welfare dynamics in the country. Unfortunately, due to data availability, no study has yet comprehensively or adequately examined the dynamics of wages or wage inequality in the country throughout the pandemic. There are a few limited studies which make use of a telephonic survey which was conducted during the pandemic's first year, which all provided really novel and useful insights for policymakers, but the sample was really small, characterized by some representativity issues, and there was a lot of missing data with respect to the wage variable. So it was argued that even imputations wouldn't be sufficient to adequately analyze wages in that data set. So hence, at this point, as far as we know, little to nothing is known about wage dynamics in the country during the pandemic. Yeah, I just described that, so we'll skip that. So quickly, this paper seeks to very descriptively and straightforwardly characterize the evolution of wages and wage inequality during the pandemic in the country. We use individual level microdata from the official source of labor market statistics in the country. That's a household survey called the Quarterly Labor Force Survey. conducted by our National Statistics Office, CSAE. And beyond just describing the evolution of the distribution, we also seek to uncover the compositional and structural drivers of these changes. So overall, it has three components. The first is we place a lot of focus and attention on the quality of the underlying wage data. The second is descriptive, just describing aggregate trends in wages across the distribution and various normative and relative wage inequality statistics or indices over time. We also consider changes in wages amongst those who remain employed, so within worker variation in wages, as a potential source of variation. And then we seek to decompose changes in wages over time from before to after the pandemic at various points into two components, one compositional and one structural, to try and uncover what was the main driver here, if any. So jumping right into the data. So we make use of, again, the Quarterly Labour Force Survey, or the QLFS for short. We make use of about 14 waves from the beginning of 2019 through to the middle of 2022. That's when roundabout all remaining pandemic-related restrictions in the country were repealed. Again, it's individual level. It's primarily a cross-sectional survey, although it does have a rotational panel component. It's nationally representative. It's at the individual level, but it's a household survey. And importantly, it includes information or data on pre-tax wages. However, there's been an emerging literature in the country which has documented substantial issues with the quality of the public version of the data. So, of course, usually collecting income data in surveys is notoriously difficult and usually characterized by a large amount of non-response around the world, people just being unwilling to report their income for whatever reason. And usually this type of non-response is non-random. It's usually systemic or related to several observable or unobservable characteristics. And usually studies around the world are pretty homogeneous in finding that non-response tends to be concentrated towards the top of the wage distribution. So hence, obviously, using the raw data is inadequate. One has to account for missing data, otherwise your estimates will be biased, and you might be subject to smaller sample sizes. So our stats office uses an imputation approach to address these issues. However, some recent studies which have gained access to the raw or unimputed versions, which are not available in the public domain, compare that data to the public domain versions and basically show that the imputation approach used by the stats office is relatively crude and results in some really implausible wage and specifically wage inequality estimates over time. Just a lot of volatility and fluctuation, which seems to be a consequence of these imputations and not the underlying data itself. Yeah, I'm happy to chat about that further, but the main point is that in the public domain data, it's impossible to distinguish actual reported wages and those which are imputed. There's no like imputation flag or binary indicating which wages were imputed versus reported, which is a pity, and it seems like something that can be easily done. And we are working with CSAE at the moment to try and carefully convince them to try and do this in the future. But the point is, using the public data will yield unreliable estimates. We avoid this by simply accessing the raw data from CSAE, thanks to our role in another project with them. So we've got the actual raw data. It doesn't include their imputations. And we, of course, adjust the raw data using two parametric methods, one for outliers and then one for missing data again. For outliers, we use this approach, which is pretty common in the literature, called the studentized regression residuals approach. It's quite simple. It entails regressing a expanded Menserian wage function on a host of demographic and labor market characteristics, predicting and standardizing the residuals, and then flagging outliers with large residuals, flagging observations with large residuals as outliers. So basically, conceptually, what that means is that individuals whose wages are very much outside or deviate from what we'd expect them to have, given the structure of the labor market, we consider as outliers. A big advantage of this approach is that it considers both tails of the distribution as opposed to just implausibly high wage earners. This results in just about 1% of the sample who reported wages as being regarded as outliers. And then for the missing data, we use an approach called multiple imputation. Briefly, for those of you who are unfamiliar, this is similar to stochastic imputation. Of course, there are many ways to impute wages for people who don't report them. You could, of course, just assign them the mean in the sample that did report them. You could give them midpoints if they reported in brackets. But all of these have been argued to be sort of characterized by issues if you're interested in doing a sort of distributional analysis. The main issue is that it creates like clumps or densities in the data, which affects your inequality estimates over time. So multiple imputation uses a parametric or regression approach to predict wages, similar to like a Menserian approach, and then it adds a random bit of error to every predicted wage. The issue with stochastic imputation is that it then treats these imputed predicted wages as real or as reported in the data set. What multiple imputation does is that it does that approach, but it does it multiple times, here about 10 times, to basically arrive at a set of estimates for each individual of what their reported wage might have been. So, of course, we never observe their actual wage. It's just impossible. They didn't report it. But we have 10 sets of plausible estimates which vary across both individuals and within individuals, which we believe gives us a relatively narrow distribution for each individual of what their wage might have been. And then using some rules in the literature, these are combined for using just averages, and the standard errors are a little complicated, but for inference they are combined to give us estimates of the full wage distribution. Using this approach, we're able to impute for nearly all missing values, 97% of wage earners, but happy to chat about that in future if anyone's more interested. We conduct a number of diagnostic checks to ensure the robustness of these results, to ensure that they're not sensitive to varying number of imputations and different model specifications for predicting those wages. And as usual, we restrict the sample to the working age. We adjust the wages for inflation and express them in real terms. All our estimates are weighted, and we adjust the standard errors for the complex survey design. So just briefly, in the survey, over time, about 50% of the employed report actual South African rand values for the wages. About 20% report them in brackets who don't report rand amounts, and then about nearly a third don't report anything at all. So we're imputing for this group here, and then also partially for this group here. And as expected, these are just kernel density estimates of the distribution of wages. The red line is people who actually reported their wages, and then the blue line is for people who reported the bracket that their wage is in, but not the actual rand amount, which we impute for. And then the gray line is for people who didn't report anything at all. The red line is the combination of everyone. And as expected, this and a number of other diagnostic tests show us that we're mostly imputing for people towards the top of the distribution, which is, again, expected. We know high wage earners are less likely to report their wages. So we use this data, and then again, we focus on descriptive trends. Firstly, what happened to wages and wage inequality over time, which I've explained earlier. And then we jump into decomposition, asking what drove these changes. We first do it at the mean using the usual OAKA blinder to explain, to break up changes in wages into two components again, compositional versus structural. That is, to what extent did changes in the characteristics of workers change the wage distribution, or explain changes in the wage distribution, and to what extent do changes in the returns to those characteristics explain changes in the wage distribution. And then we repeat that same approach, but using recentered influence functions, which is a generalized approach, but we can do it across the whole distribution. Okay. Let's jump right in. So at the peak, at the onset of the distribution here in Q2 of 2020, we find that across the distribution, real wages spiked. Is that the 5-minute mark or the 2-minute mark? 5-minute mark. Okay, that's great. Thanks. So real wages across the distribution spiked. Even at the median, that's about like the median wage is about 32 Rand in June 2022 rands, which is equivalent to like 1.3, 1.4 pounds per hour. But this increase at the onset was temporary. Very quickly thereafter, as the labor market recovered, wages again across the whole distribution slowly returned back to their pre-pandemic levels. We asked to what extent this can be explained by the significant amount of job loss in the period. South Africa levels of employment dropped by about 14%. It's about 2.2 million people at the onset. Job loss was across the entire wage distribution, but significantly higher amongst lower wage earners, which again is pretty consistent with the international literature. About a third of workers in the lowest decile of the wage distribution lost their jobs, compared to about 10% of workers in the richest decile. So this certainly explains, at least partially, the spike that we see in the beginning of the pandemic. It's a mechanic spike. Low wage workers essentially drop out of the distribution, and hence average wages spike up. We explore the extent two pandemic-related factors can explain this heterogeneity in job loss. That's your ability to work from home and whether or not you're characterized in an essential industry, which meant that you could continue working during the pandemic. And again, we see that low-wage workers were far less likely to either work from home or be classified as essential workers, which again is quite consistent with the literature. But additionally, when we consider individuals who remained employed, we find significant and positive increases in wages for these individuals. On average, looking at the changes in monthly wages from before to after the pandemic, again, restricting the sample to the balanced sample who remain employed, the average increase is about 26% in real terms, which is pretty stark. There have been a few studies in the literature which have documented this somewhat counterintuitive result and attributed it to various things like changes in demand to certain industries, changes in the distribution of working hours for certain individuals at home, people who changed jobs versus those who remained in the same job. But overall, despite these various potential mechanisms, we consistently find significant and positive increases across these various subgroups. So in addition to a compositional effect, it seems like there's a structural effect at play. And these wage increases were, amongst the employed, were larger towards the bottom of the distribution compared to the top. We argue in the paper that we think this plausibly has to do with a very specific policy in South Africa at the time, which resulted in a lot of low-wage workers receiving, it was a wage subsidy, but receiving wages in excess of their usual wage for a temporary period of time. But again, for the sake of time, I won't be able to go into that here. But the point is, we see both a compositional and structural dynamic here at play. When we restrict the sample to just the employed, the cross-sectional waves of employed, we see not really significant changes in inequality estimates over the period here, just focusing on the Gini. A little bit of fluctuation in the tail index there, but we find that this is mostly driven by one or two outliers. But the point is, the cross-sectional estimates seem to suggest that wage inequality didn't change by much. But again, this restricts the sample to the employed, so it explicitly doesn't account for those compositional effects that we've seen prior. So if we do a simple counterfactual exercise where we retain the unemployed in the sample and just assign them 0 wages, and then we compare inequality index estimates from before to after the pandemic, year on year, we observe compared to the previous year where the unemployed are retained and where they are retained during 2020, this suggests about an 8% increase in inequality at the onset attributable to the pandemic itself. So it seems like accounting for these compositional effects explicitly influences your inequality estimates, and if you don't do so, it might lead to some misinterpretations. 2 more minutes? Great, thank you. Jumping into the decompositional results. So at the pandemic's onset, these are the just visual Owaka blinder estimates of the change in log wages over time. The gray bars are the composition effects. So again, changes in wages due to changes in the characteristics of the workforce. The red bars are the structure effects, so changes in the returns to those characteristics. The dominant effect was the composition effect here. At the onset, the composition effect explains about 70% of the change in wages at the pandemic's onset. And as the pandemic progressed and the labor market partially recovered, the dominance of the composition effect reduced with time, and the structure effect instead became more prominent, which suggests potentially persistent changes in the structure of the labor market, which is an open-ended empirical question for future research if we get future waves of this data. We can break down both the compositional and structure effects into specific covariates, And we find that with respect to the composition effect, 5 covariates primarily explain that effect. It's education, it's unionization, formality, occupation, and industry. So in a nutshell, that basically suggests that we know the profile of workers shifted towards workers who are more educated, more unionized, more likely to be in the formal sector, more educated, etc. So this again just reflects the regressive distribution of job loss. The structure effect is a little bit more messy and unclear. We don't pick up any significant estimates in that regard. I won't go into this in more detail. Thanks. I won't go into this in more detail just because of time constraints, but essentially we find pretty consistent findings that we saw at the mean of the distribution and then across the distribution over time. Apart from the exception of right at the bottom of the distribution, we see this larger structure effect, which again speaks to those larger within worker wage gains we saw previously. Anyway, so just to wrap up quickly. So again, this paper was quite descriptive in nature and just sought to understand descriptively changes in wages and inequality during the pandemic in the most unequal country in the world, and what were the drivers of those changes. And we find basically 5 key takeaways here, which I won't go into in detail, but in essence, job loss primarily explains changes in wages and wage inequality during the pandemic here, which is quite intuitive. But we also uncover a non-negligible, although smaller, structure effect, and the persistence of the structure effect persists with time. So that is suggestive of some structural changes in the labor market beyond the pandemic. A lot more future work we want to do, include some pandemic-specific phenomena like remote workability in the decomposition models, and extend the rift to look at specific inequality indices. But open to whatever feedback that everyone might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this great presentation. I learned a lot, and I would like to disagree with your first statement that this is just a paper that is related to COVID, because in my opinion, it's not the case at all. Actually, most of the things that I learned were about like resilience to wage shocks, and I think that there's a great deal that in that direction that you can expand. So I'll summarize briefly the main things that I retained on this paper, whose main strength for me is the really, really careful work that you do on that privately acquired data that sheds light on a lot of works that have been done on South Africa as well. And the fact that, as you stress in the paper but didn't in the presentation, so I highlight this, you have a way of going beyond the very, very short-term studies that make up most of the literature. So I think these are some of the two global strengths of the paper, and then you have this really careful work that considers the evolution of earnings inequality in the most income unequal country in the world along several lines. So the first thing that you do, and I think is really relevant, is doing hourly versus monthly earnings, which encapsulate the capacity that you have, which might change because of the shock to work a given number of hours, notably if your job is not essential or you can't work it from home, which is going to be a huge margin of adjustment, as you show. Then you make use of panel versus cross-section data to look at within worker changes, which might be due to differences in the bargaining power that you have on the labor market because of COVID, which might be due to you getting fired. And you shed light on some of these mechanisms. I will go into detail on where I think that we could learn even more from the setting that you have. And then you have these various measures of inequality, normative, descriptive, that you complement with a Gini measure that accounts for the composition effect. So the fact that people from the lower end of the distribution have been fired, bringing the average wage up, which I think tells us a lot about all of the angles on which we can see that case study. Some of the graphs that I put up were the graphs from the paper that I learned the most from. Some of those were on your presentation. So I'm happy to see that I saw the same interest as you. So I will go quickly over them. But this one, the fact that workers were more likely to be able to work from home at the top of the distribution, for me, goes way much beyond the only COVID-19 case study. It touches on resilience, it touches on different literatures that are related to what extent can your industry be outsourced, be offshored, which I think you have a lot to say about, partly because of your data, and which I think you could afford to expand on much more. So this graph I liked a lot. this decomposition that shows us that because lower-end workers got fired, the overall wage first grew, and these were the effects that were dominating in spite of pro-poor wage policies, was super informative. And then finally, the things that we learned about this data set was super surprising to me. So this graph you didn't show, this is the difference in the distribution of hourly wages from the public quarterly LFS data to the multiple imputation approach, which I understood was your main approach. So there's a lot of work on the data. The data section is 20 pages. So I really hope that I didn't miss any crucial thing. But this graph I was very surprised by. And I think that you could even stress on that even more. So because of that, I will go over the results and just tell you about the way that I think the contribution of these papers goes beyond COVID-19, as you alluded to at first. There is this data work that you use to show relevant results about COVID-19, but just tells us a lot about how studies have been conducted on the country for some time. And I think you could stress that contribution more if first you showed us how this database compared to other databases that are available on South Africa. So for top incomes, maybe if you could get your hands on admin data, that would be also great, obviously. But also you mentioned another database that was called Needs something. And I think that you could, in that data section, show us how you work means that we can do some more relevant studies of South Africa because the needs data doesn't produce the same quality. So I think that would be useful. And also that you could afford to show us how this database doesn't only provide more exact descriptives, but also how it changes result from what we understand of the way. So when you run your panel regression, your cross-section regressions, I would have loved to see the results on the badly imputed data just to know how vital it is to get these imputations right when trying to have the effects. And then there are all of the other pieces of the literature that you touch upon, which I think go beyond COVID-19, which is resilience, so differential resilience to labor market shocks. You could say much more on, and I have some proposal for heterogeneity analysis that you could implement. And also COVID-19 related works in the context of high informality. The reason why I'm mentioning this work in particular is that they have the same result that you have, that workers experience wage increases when they were able to transition to another job spell during COVID, which might tell us something related to the effect of COVID-19, in particular in countries with high level of informality, for example. Some really quick points that we can talk about more afterwards. So your setting made me really curious, and I thought that a bit of contextuals and the descriptives were lacking. I wanted to know what was the harshness of COVID policies, why all of these people got fired, how salient it was, how frequent it was. I wanted to know about the living wage. Was it in concordance with the minimum wage? That kind of things that was missing for me. This is on the extended mission. I think we can talk about it later. One thing that I wanted to tell you about is that your wages regressions are on the main job that people work. If there is a differential trend in the extent to which people pick up multiple jobs to mitigate for the wage impacts of COVID-19, you might be missing on something on that angle. And then some heterogeneity. I would be especially keen on seeing some differentials on the ability that you had to retain your job, so self-employment, for example, whether you choose to get fired or not, and on which were the offshoreable or the industries that you could work from home and how they influenced the things. The low wage policy I was super interested in, but we can get into that later. Thank you very, very much, and that's it for me.
Hi, Tim. I'm just curious how much you're able to say about the informal sector. So arguably, COVID had the most significant impact on informal sector workers. So I'm curious about, do you have anything about job losses, particularly in the informal sector, and sort of the types of jobs that are lost versus maintained in that sector?
Thank you very much. I thought the paper was very interesting. But from the policy point of view, I miss a little bit, like, what is the message? I understand that the main result is that inequality increased because the poor workers lost their jobs, and the workers that have a higher education can work from home. And also my understanding, and if you can touch it, that unions also help to support workers more than other workers. But I would like to know, what is the message of the policy? Was the policy adequate? Was short? How, if something like this happen again, what should we, how policy should adapt? Okay, thank you.
That's great. Thanks. Thanks very much. I presume, yeah, I can respond. No further questions. Thanks so much, Romaine, for your very detailed and comprehensive response. I really appreciate that. The paper in its current form is very long. It's like 60, 70 pages. That is because it's come from my thesis and it's relatively unrevised. So my apologies for that. So I really do appreciate you being as thorough as you were. If you skipped entire sections, I wouldn't have blamed you, but it seems like you didn't. So thank you. Yeah, all good points. Nothing that I don't think I disagree with. There's a little bit of overlap with some other pieces of work that we've already done that I had to exclude from this paper and include in, like, for instance, another chapter of the thesis. Obviously, this needs to be an independent piece of work, so I will need to pull a lot of that in. Like you mentioned, the changes in working hours, for instance, that I don't touch on here, but it's in another chapter of the thesis that obviously affects hourly wage estimates and hourly wage inequality estimates. So for the revision of the paper for journal submission, we'll definitely be doing that. Thanks. Yeah, and your notes on how these findings go beyond the pandemic-related literature is really encouraging, based on what I mentioned when I started this talk. Differential resilience, I like that quite a lot. Persistence, the role of data quality, etc. Yeah, we're thinking of potentially breaking up the paper in two, with one focusing explicitly on data quality, which ties into a lot of the already existing literature in South Africa, which I think would be great, but we can expand on what they've done quite easily with access to this data. So I like that you enjoyed that section particularly. Comparing it to other data sets, talking about various extensions that we can do here, specifically with respect to that wage subsidy policy, I think is currently very much lacking in the version here. So I really appreciate that and would love these slides if I can get them from you. Thanks. Shakiba, thanks for your comment. Yep, absolutely right. Agree with you. I'm sure you've seen also empirically, yeah, the informal sector suffered disproportionately more in many places around the world, in South Africa included. The rate of job loss, it was about 20% of informal sector workers lost their jobs. Formal sector was about 10%, so double the incidence, so it's bad. With respect to the types of jobs within the informal sector, I'm not entirely sure. There's a lot of work by Mike Rogan, if you're interested in that, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Yeah, you can check that out. What we haven't done in this paper is, which your comment reminds me of, is between group variation in wages and wage inequality. Honestly, getting to like 60, 70 pages, we thought, okay, I don't know if there's scope to include that here. So we used it as a bit of a scapegoat to say future work, but definitely important to do. Yeah. And Marina, thanks for your comment. The policy message, I do think in the current paper that is lacking for sure. I think so it'll be something that we'll have to think about more carefully. I think there's something to be said about the role that this wage subsidy policy played in driving wages upwards, particularly in a time of crisis for very vulnerable workers. And that was a very short-term aspect of the policy that was very quickly changed, which we touch on in two other papers that we do. Not related here, but it's definitely, I think, an important extension that can play into policy implications going forward beyond the pandemic. So thanks very much. Yeah. All right.
Okay. Hi again. So I'm Romaine Loubes. I'm a PhD student at the Paris School of Economics, and today I will be telling you about my paper that is entitled Trade-displaced or Trade-stuck, and that is interested in the way that self-employed workers in particular react and adapt to trade shocks in low-income countries. So in order to motivate this question, let me show you this graph that is drawn from the IPUMS dataset showing that Sub-Saharan Africa is the region of the world with the lowest share of wage earners and the highest share of self-employed workers. It's also, as we have been hearing about for the past 2 days, a region which is considering the implementation of very big and potentially very impactful policies, for example, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which would have effects on labor markets. And the problem and the question that I try to tackle here is the fact that we don't know as of yet what are the impacts of trade shocks on labor markets when these labor markets are predominantly made up of self-employed workers. There have been works on informality, but really here we stress on the fact that self-employment is not just a particular flavor of informality, and the main reason for that is that self-employed people do not have to get fired if they don't want to. So this is the decision power over job exit that we are going to exploit to look at differential responses. And that means that when in other contexts trade shocks entail worker displacement, that's the case, for example, in the China shocks, but in studies of other contexts, for example, in studies of commodity shocks in Brazil, that pointed at unemployment and informality as job market responses, even in informal labor forces, self-employed workers do not have to get displaced if they don't want to. And that means that in that context, outside options, so where you could get displaced to, is going to be very important for these workers who might get stuck in these occupations if they have nowhere else to go, and for policymakers who might see their reallocation policies slow down by stuck workers. The question that I'm going to answer using the Rwandan context and the shock on the used clothing supply chain is thus, what are the adaptation margins of low-income countries' self-employed workers to trade-driven earnings shocks? And I'm going to be considering several margins that have been studied in the literature. That's migration, labor supply, and occupational choice. That's the standard ones. And some margins over which the self-employed have particular decision-making power compared to wage earners, for example. That's the choice of hours worked and how you diversify your income over several earning sources in a context where 1/3 of my workforce holds several jobs at once within the same week. Then I'm going to try and answer the question of who among the self-employed can adjust at all. So that's a question of resilience. And I'm first going to show heterogeneity on demographics, mostly gender, with some striking heterogeneity. And in more recent extensions, looking more into the intra-household responses to that trade shock. In order to do that, I'm going to use the used clothing supply chain that was flowing to Rwanda as it was in a lot of countries in sub-Saharan Africa. There is a multi-hundreds of millions of dollar chain each year flowing mostly from global north country, US, UK, Germany, France, China, toward poorer countries, and in the great majority of it, except for Ukraine, sub-Saharan African ones. So usually the way that it goes is that you donate a piece of clothing and you think that it's going to be sold in a country of collection. So that's what I thought, at least. And then a sizable share of that is eventually going to be exported to other countries and to end up in the hands of used clothing retailers, who are a vastly, a majority self-employed occupation, at least in my context, Rwanda, where it is 90% of used clothing retailers who are self-employed. This was providing Eastern African households with an affordable source for clothing, but also was criticized heavily for hindering textile industries in that zone. So in February 2016, the Eastern African community proposed a proposal to increase tariffs prohibitively on used clothing, so in the order of a 10-fold import tariff increase. Because the US is one of the biggest importers of used clothing, they responded with a threat to retaliate by excluding these countries' apparel sectors from the African Growth and Opportunity Act, the Free Trade Agreement. And as a result, all of the EAC countries except for Rwanda abandoned the project, leaving Rwanda to implement a 10-fold import tariff increase on used clothing and shoes, which I will refer for conciseness as chagwa, because that's the word in Kinyarwanda, in June 2016, and getting excluded from AGOA 2 years later. The first impact, in the absence of a textile industry that demand could reallocate to, was that used clothing imports went down dramatically, prices for clothing went up, and the primary effect the primary negative effect of that import shock was borne by used clothing retailers who used to be purchasing these bales of clothing at wholesalers and now were purchasing them for a much higher price. So this is the population that I'm going to be focusing on, caguwa retailers. In this paper, I thus studied that sizable import tariff increase on that harmed the population that was made up of 90% self-employed workers. And the way that I do that is I leverage access to data on formal and informal firms through a census for Rwanda to construct a geographical exposure measure to the shock, and I complement that to occupation variation in how exposed to the shock you were using household survey data, which amount to a triple difference setting. Using that regression, I unearth responses that do not match the literature that has focused on richer countries and countries in which self-employment is less prevalent. And I find new adaptation margins that are only available to self-employed workers. I formalize these responses in a very parsimonious framework that I won't go into today, but which predicts that the easiness with which you can reallocate to a shock on your main occupation depends on the quality of your options on the labor market. And then, using the fact that Rwandan self-employed retailers had worse options on the labor market than men self-employed retailers, I study responses by gender. I find striking heterogeneity in reallocation responses, and I notably find that women are getting stuck in retail as a result of that trade shock. Okay, so I will tell you a little bit about the data now. No, I will tell you about the literature. But very quickly, so the first value that I bring to the literature on trade shocks and labor markets is result-driven, because I find that the commonly studied responses, unemployment and informality, do not have to be mandatory when we are studying different labor markets. In the case of self-employed labor markets, these responses do not appear, and instead there are new margins of adaptation that are only available to self-employed workers. When studying the resilience of these workers, I also participate in the literature about gender differences in power on the labor market and the amount to which self-employment is constrained, especially for women in sub-Saharan Africa. I do that leveraging that establishment census from the Rwanda Statistical Office, for which I was able to access a string variable that had very detailed industry description, because caguwa is such a very precise industry in which there are not that many people. You cannot access that through standard measures such as ISIC4. And so what I did is that I looked directly into that variable, searching for the term caguwa, which then allowed me to construct that spatial index of caguwa intensity, which is the number of caguwa workers from the establishment census over the total active population. It's extremely polarized. It's not a Kigali story. It doesn't just happen in Kigali. And there are 3 districts which are extremely exposed to that trade. I will both use discontinuous exposure variable and discrete exposure variables with little change to my results. I combine that with data on workers, which importantly for the context that I study is at the job level. So rather than having observations at the level of an individual, I'm able to see all of the job spells that an individual has worked for the past year over the interview year. And using these individual and job level observations allow me to speak to the 4 margins that I mentioned. So labor supply, either the hours that you work at a given job or in total as an individual, the occupational choice that you make, what is your main job of the week, whether you migrate, which is a standard response that you want to study, and what is your consumption and income. So a quickly summary is that this is when the shock happens, and I have both a pre and a post household survey to study the shock that I combine with establishment census before the shock, obviously for the reverse causality reasons. This is the triple difference that I'm leveraging, so I think it makes little sense to assume that trends were parallel between exposed districts to non-exposed districts or from retailers to non-retailers. So that's the reason behind the fact that I put these 2 variations into a triple difference. looking at the impact on trends. So that's the post variable indicator for whether this is the second round of the IHLCS, of being in a district 1 standard deviation more exposed to the shock when you are an independent retailer on the outcomes that I choose to study. So this assumption, which I think is more viable, is that the extent to which retailers are different from non-retailers, so that's the retailer premia, is not supposed to be affected from exposed districts to non-exposed districts by something else than the policy from 2013 to 2016. When I also add a district time fixed effect to ease down the worries of smuggling, notably. Some like trends in smuggling that might happen, especially because some of the more exposed districts border Uganda. When I study heterogeneity by gender, that amounts to a quadruple difference, which I would spare you the details of, and the fixed effects become district times sex times time, because smuggling could be a gendered activity, among other worries that this helps mitigate. So before going into the results, let me show you some evidence without all of these controls, just looking at the raw data on how retailers are different from the rest of the population and how that varies because of the shock. So in terms of income, retailers always earn more in a week across all of their income sources than non-retailers, and that's in the bottom of the exposed districts or the 10% top most exposed districts. But we can see that when the gap is widening from 2013 to 2016 in the least exposed district, that is not the case, and the gap is actually closing in the 10% top exposed district. And when you look at hourly earnings and not at income, so really at the wages of these people, so profits minus expenses in the case of self-employed people, it's the gap is also closing, but because these hourly earnings are decreasing for retailers in the 10% most exposed districts. So this you can see in the results on income. You can see that the results on income are stronger, but this is mitigated for because people are working more hours. But when you look at which job they are working these hours, using the fact that I have job level data, this is not done in the retail job. They are working more hours in other occupation because they are working several occupations per week. But the earnings decrease are indeed coming from the retail job, indicating that this policy is at the source of this income and earnings decrease. When you look at reallocation strategies, you first see with respect to the rest of the literature, our workers do not go into unemployment and informality, and in fact, they don't even leave their independent retail job. Instead, they are working more jobs within a week and overlapping them to a larger extent. So within a year, they are working more months at each job, which seems to be a new adaptation margin. Occupationally, they are working retail adjacent, so wage jobs in retail or farm occupations. I put that into a theoretical framework that allows you to have multiple jobs that are constrained, taking inspiration from the data, which shows me that labor supply is constrained in independent retail. And the prediction from that is that your reallocation is going to heavily depend on the quality of your outside options. Because of this, I will run impacts on women and see how much it differs from women to men. Just a quick motivation. I don't think I need to motivate this enormously, but even within self-employment, where you would expect that women are able to do basically what they want because they are their own bosses, you see that women are doing much less different occupations than men for all years, and men are doing 100 different things and women are doing around 50, which lead them to be much more concentrated where they operate. So this is the share of workers in the top 3 most frequent jobs in self-employment, and women are much more concentrated, which both make them more vulnerable and less able to reallocate afterwards. Looking at this, I will consider this heterogeneity in this quadruple difference that I told you about, expecting, because of my framework, that women should have a lower trend than men for a given level of exposure in the take-up of paid employment after the shock, a lower trend in the likelihood of giving up on the self-employed retail job, and overall less elasticity of labor supply to that shock. First, what we see with respect to exposure, I told you that they were differently exposed because of their concentration, is that women are actually taking up the bulk of the negative earnings effects. When you allow for that heterogeneity by gender, the effect on men becomes insignificant for the main job of the week. So they tend to draw away from this job, making them not the main job of the week anymore when they're affected, and women are just remaining in these jobs and suffering the brunt of the impact on wages. This is amplified for hourly earnings, which indicates that they might be working even more hours to mitigate for that earnings decrease. There are two ways of looking at that. So you can see that as a widening of the gender gap within retail, within a given district. So that's the bottom right panel showing you that women are declining with respect to retailer men in the top exposed district. Or you can see that accounting for the composition effect that women are overrepresented in Chagua, as the fact that when in other occupations and for the other gender, the top exposed districts is always paid more, and this was the case before the shock. In self-employed retail and for women, the earnings are actually becoming exactly similar to those of self-employed retail women in less exposed districts. This translates into their income, so that means that they are not able to mitigate the shock by working other jobs. And the reason for that is that when men decrease hours worked at the independent retail job as a result of the shock, women are actually doubling down on that job and increasing the hours that they work at that job to try and mitigate earnings losses. Nobody is leaving the job altogether, but men are reducing hours worked at that job, effectively making it not their main job of the week sometimes, and women are increasing. And if you look at which hours they are giving up on in order to be increasing these hours in retail, you see that they are decreasing the numbers of jobs that they work per week. So the number of jobs and not the number of paid jobs, indicative of the fact that they are giving up on unpaid jobs. And when you look at the type of these unpaid jobs that they are abandoning, you see that women are giving up on unpaid family member jobs. So that explains why there are not that many effects on consumption of them abandoning these jobs. But these were jobs that first they chose to do, so that were bringing them some kind of utility, and that were also bringing the public goods to the household. So that entails potential effects on children outcomes or on other household non-monetary welfare measures, which I will study into more detail in the coming weeks and months. Men were the ones doing at retail adjacent jobs, so sales but not independent retail, the last column, indicative of the fact that they were able to reallocate towards these sectors when women were not. I do a lot of things to justify the robustness of my results. Discretizing the spatial exposure is, thank you, is one of them. I won't go into detail into all of this, and these days I'm studying the extent to which these responses vary when only one spouse in a household is impacted versus the two. I think that self-employment is an underexplored angle for those wishing to study trade shocks and how they affect sub-Saharan African labor markets. This response can be rationalized in a framework that incorporates the constraints to the jobs that might be particular to these workers, and studies that ignore outside options could miss opposing trends, including by gender, entailing empowerment responses. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I think this paper is actually very interesting, and because it really looked to a margin that other papers have not looked, which is the impact of trade shock in self-employed workers in Rwanda. I also find that the identification is clear of the shock because, suddenly it's increased the amount of imported clothes, used clothes that are imported. You can see in the data here on the chart that the price skyrocketed in 2016, and that's the main input for selling used clothes. So in this case, it's kind of, there is not many issues about reallocation of the production process, right? Because you just have one input. Now, what are the main findings? That what is interesting is that she finds that workers that are in areas that are more exposed to the shock, they experience a decline of earnings. And the key question here is that what is surprising is that they respond more by working more hours on the business that is flailing, right? And women do that. And when you conclude is that and this comes to the cost of time that they spend at home, and we don't know exactly what is the cost for the family. And while men it's more able to reallocate on the other jobs. So I think these are main findings. I think they are new and they are a nice contribution to the literature. So what are my comments? First, I think that I miss a lot about what is, and you're going to see that the questions that I'm going to bring are exactly because I miss this part, the characteristics of this business. So what are these workers who are working the Chagua business? And in particular, what is this business for the household? So that's why for me it was very, was not clear. Is this a family business, like from the household's point of view, that a business that they have as a side, that the man have another work and the wife runs this business and that they work together as a family? Or is this just, or the structure of family in Rwanda is more like a Western structure that man has one job and woman have a job? So that for me it was very important because the way that you frame the paper is really about that the impact of the shock is different for men and women. But the way that I see is more about a household, right? And it's about a family that needs to allocate resources, men and women, labor across different jobs. And the considerations that can have for these jobs are the income of the jobs, but also the risk. And that's something that is not touched on the paper, which is maybe the woman, they do not move for this job because it's a safe job that they have already done in the past. And we know that it is important for the insurance of the family, of the household. So if this is a household business, it's natural that maybe men are going to go and try to look for a job that generate higher earnings, while the women are going to allocate more hours to this job because it's a safe job that they know that although the return of this job has declined, it's still a job that generates a positive income. So that's why I felt that the discussion about the insurance mechanisms of the household, and also what is the importance of the income of this Chagua business for the family was absent of the business, of the paper. And I feel that the way that you have your model framework and you choose a representative agent model, and it's maximized between the different occupations, and it choose the occupation that has the higher income. And your conclusion is that, yes, women do not have access to high income. That's why they work more hours, because they want to have the higher consumption. It misses whether there is some portfolio choices across occupations, right? And I think that this should be treated a little bit more, it should be discussed on the paper. And the second point is, because you want to make the distinction of your work with the work of Rafael Dix Carneiro or Gabriel Liceias, that they find that the impact on the Brazil, the shock is higher for informal workers, right? And in this case, we find that men work more on farmers' wage. I think it would be also helpful are these informal jobs? Are these just farming jobs? Right? How do you treat these jobs? Because I see these as like for men that the impact is similar, but for women is different. But I think it's require a little bit more for discussion. But thank you very much. I think that the paper is very promising, but I would put more thought about the household aspect of it. So now we can maybe open for questions, and then you can come here to answer them because they are recorded.
Thanks very much, Romaine. Great, very thorough presentation, and presumably a great paper. Yeah, two quick questions. I agree. There seems to be a potential, like family structure, as Marina mentioned, role at play here, which you've already explored, but just couldn't include here. Would love to hear your thoughts on that, or if there's data availability. Presumably you have household size in the data set, etc. And then two, I know you just didn't have enough time for the robustness tests, but I saw you mention that you did some event studies to check for the parallel trends, etc. I think you said, you had earlier waves of the data set, which allowed you to do that. I just wondered what, in the context of a quadruple difference in difference, which I'm not familiar with to that extent, how might that influence the credibility of those estimates, given also the explosion of that new literature, which I'm sure you're familiar with as well. Yeah. I don't know the answer. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the discussion. I am implementing some of these points and will implement the rest because it's really extremely useful for what I'm doing. So thank you very much. I'm glad that you're both mentioning these types of collective household models because this is what I'm trying to do these days. And I'm notably looking at to what extent that Chagua business is the only business at which the household is working. And I find that although some households do that, because of the increased risk of doing that, when they are hit by the shock, their earnings are the one that plunge the most. It's quite a marginal choice to be both husband and wife working on the same Chagua business. And that's also because Chagua overrepresents women, so arguably it's one of the self-employment industries that women are the least excluded from, and so maybe husbands are letting their wives do that while they go on to more profitable activities. So there's that risk-sharing argument, and there is that exclusion from other self-employed activities, which I'm not sure I can shed light on with the data that I have, and which could be due to a lot of different factors, but which I will endeavor to look at more. Especially, maybe, as you referred, women cannot reallocate to other occupations, either because they value the safety of their occupation, because they have a family to take care of. So I do some heterogeneity on being the sole breadwinner of the house. That is a little bit underpowered, but that doesn't show any differential trend for now. But this is what I'm trying to do. Or maybe they're doing that because they can't do anything else. On that thing, so to answer to the rest of what you were saying on the allocation process between spouses, I'm right now looking at how a woman's response when their husband is hit is different from a husband's response when their wives are hit, finding that when husbands are hit, women are taking hours off their job to reallocate them to their husband's activity when husbands are not doing that when their wives are hit. So finding some evidence that I think could speak to that point, which I agree is missing from the paper, and which I think you were also referring to. I'm hoping that I'm covering what you were saying. About the event study, there is a round that doesn't look at all like the future rounds, which I'm still cleaning. The event study leveraged the fact that I have information for each month of the interview year. So it's a study that takes into account seasonality. So basically the 2013 round is a round from October 2013 to October 2014. And when I do the event study, I plot the coefficient of interest using the fact that the parallel trend assumption for triple difference just requires the parallel trend of the triple difference coefficient. So that's what it looks like. It looks like an event study with the triple coefficients being plotted. And I will show it to you if you want. Thank you very much. Thank you for this good comments.
Okay, so I'm going to be presenting today. So this is a broad research agenda that we have at the IMF about the impact of AI on the future of work. This is, we came out with a big report in January, and this is one of the papers that is behind the report on the first part of the report. So I think probably we all researchers have already noticed that AI is impacting how we work, right? The activities that we do. Probably we all have already experimented with some of chatbots, but more of that is going to have an impact on the economic structure. And possible is going to generate winners and losers. However, if you follow this literature or have read the newspapers in the beginning of the year, you have noticed that a lot of the studies focus really in advanced economies, in the US, in the UK, and not much in an emerging market developing economies. And that's why the main reason that we start working on this topic is that we felt that it was also important to understand what is the potential impact of AI in emerging markets developing economies. And the second thing that is relevant as well is that most of the work done in the literature is really speaking about the workers or occupations of workers to artificial intelligence. So how much the tasks that workers do in certain occupations overlap with the current capabilities of of artificial intelligence, but not so much about whether this overlap is going to deliver an increase in workers' productivity or is going to pose risks for the worker job. So we also try to bring a little bit, contribute to the literature to be speaking about the potential for complementarity or the risk of substitution. So we want to answer two questions with these papers. How does AI exposure vary across countries, particularly between emerging markets and advanced economies? And can we say something about the potential for complementarities and substitutions within countries? So let me just give the main findings. So the potential of complementarities, it cuts across many exposure occupations. So there are occupations with high exposure and high complementarities like professional managers, but there are certain occupations as well that have high exposure and complementarity like clerical support and workers. And what we find in general is that agriculture workers are just less exposed to AI. And the AI is more likely to have a polarized effect in advanced economies than emerging markets. And in general, within countries, females, high educated workers and high income workers are more exposed, and they also have a high potential for complementarity. So let me cut because we are running out of time. So let's just jump in. So what we do? So first we build on the work of previous research that look at the AI exposure across occupation. For this work, we're particularly focused on the measures developed by Felton. And what he does is exactly using ONET. So ONET is a dictionary of occupation in the US that catalog the tasks that each occupation does. So what Felton does is that to look at the overlap between these tasks and the AI tools, and this is going to give you a measure of exposure of for occupation. So a occupation is higher exposure when many of these tasks that the occupation that the worker perform on these occupations overlap with the capabilities that AI has right now. So now, what is interesting about that is that this exposure don't talk about complementarity. So what we do is that we look at two parts of ONET that have been less explored in the literature. which is the work context and skills. So to give an example of what are the work contexts that we select, for example, communication. Does the job require face-to-face interaction? Does it require you to public speak? Responsibility. Does the decisions made of these jobs impact someone's health, someone's well-being? The physical condition, whether the job is done inside or outside. The consequence of error, and also the criticality of these errors. The degree of routinization, so if you're doing repetitive tasks, and the last skill zone, that's more about the education and training. So, for example, we create, using these 6 measures, we create a new index, complementarity index, that a higher index level means that there is more potential for complementarity, or another interpretation is shielding, meaning that this job is going to be protected of AI developments. So let me give an example of a judge. A judge is an occupation that is high exposed to AI because AI tools are able to summarize a large amount of information, so go through cases. However, it's less likely that society is already ready to delegate the decisions that a judge takes that affect the human life to an AI tool, right? So it's a decision that is going to be kept through humans. Now, similar, a clerical worker as well have a high exposure to AI. However, decisions or mistakes made for clerical workers have less critical consequences. So in this case, a clerical worker is more exposed to AI, but maybe is more at risk. So let me explain how we look at occupations. Look at this graph on your left. And what we can see is that on the x-axis, that the higher values of AIOE, that is our exposure measures, mean that you are higher, the occupation is higher exposed, and the higher values on the y-axis means high complementarity. So we can see that a judge has high exposure and high complementarity, while a worker working telemarketing has as well high exposure and low complementarity, and then economists are they're in the median, so a little bit with a lot of risks, let's put it this way. But we look at, so we use this framework to look at occupations, looking at occupations that are above the median as occupations with high potential for complementarity, and occupations below the median, occupations at low level of complementarity. So now let's, okay, since we have not so much time, I want to be able to speak about the data. So what we're going to do, and we're going to select 6 countries that we have good micro data, because we're really going to go granular on the occupation categories. These countries are Brazil, Colombia, India, South Africa, UK, and the US, and we use at ISCO at 403 digital code. And we try to take periods that are post-COVID or after COVID, but not taking COVID periods. So this is just a chart that is not from the paper, but from the staff discussion note, but which is very similar in the paper. But what is the key here is that, and the main difference is that in advanced economies, there is a much larger share of workers that are in high exposed occupation than in emerging markets and low-income countries. However, when we look at within occupations that are exposed, we find that they are in dark red, which are the occupations that are more likely to benefit from AI or to be shielded from AI. This share is much higher in advanced economies. And this shows that advanced economies, in our case in the US and UK, they are going to be more in the front, they are going to be more likely to be impacted by AI in the short term, but also more likely to benefit because there is much more workers that are being prepared to using this the improvements in AI technology, while EMs and leaks are going to be not so much impact on the short run, but if they don't take proper actions, they may lose some opportunities in terms of gains of productivity. So here we focus in two countries, the UK and the India. And what we want to understand is what drives this difference in exposure and complementarity across countries. And clearly from the chart is the difference in economic structure. While in the UK, there is a large share of workers in professional and manager occupations, and these two occupations are occupations that are highly exposed to AI, but also has a high degree of complementarity, while India still have a large share of workers in agricultural occupations and elementary occupations, and in general, these occupations have a very little degree of exposure to AI. So really the difference in the economic structure is what explains this main difference across countries and across countries with different development levels. However, what is interesting here that despite these countries have such a different level of development, within countries we find a very similar patterns across demographic groups. So focus on the chart on the left, we see that in most countries of our sample, women are more exposed to AI. So in this figure, we are just looking at occupations that are, we call high exposure and high complementarity. And also they have a high degree of potential for complementarity because in general, women are more in professional occupations, and these are occupations that may benefit, while they also are more in clerical occupations, which are occupations that are at risk. India is the only exception because India has still female labor force participation is quite low in India compared to other countries, and there is a lot of women still working in agriculture. Now, when we look across education, and I think it is like it was mostly prominent in the newspaper, is that the AI is going to impact workers with higher levels of education. And we can see this as well, that is the same across countries. However, these workers as well have the higher potential for benefiting from AI, which if you focus on the dark red, then workers with lower education level. And this picture is very different when we discuss previous trends of technology, for example, automation, that usually impact the middle skill to low skill workers. AI is going to change more the job and the occupations of workers with higher education level. And moving to look across the income distribution, to be precise, earnings distribution, what is surprising is that the focus on the occupations that are more at risk, we see that these occupations are equally distributed across the earnings decile. In India, it's a little different, that slight increase after the fourth decile, which imply that the risks that artificial intelligence are going to bring, they are equally distributed across the income distribution. However, when we look for the occupations that have more capacity to benefit and even maybe experience an increase in their earnings, these occupations are concentrated at the top of the income distribution, showing that the gains from AI may be concentrated at the top, while the risks are equally distributed. So within countries, artificial intelligence may generate an increase of income inequality. And interesting here, this pattern is very similar across countries, despite that these countries have very different levels of development. Now, let me conclude. So what we find is that AI may generate labor market shifts, and what we are worried is that may increase inequality across countries. We think countries will find a very similar patterns of AI to increase income inequality within countries, because workers that have a higher level of educations are in better positions to benefit from these technologies. Now, what I don't discuss here, but I discuss in my in the paper from the fund, is that we look at the countries, and I think I have a picture here. So, okay, so I will talk about this because I think this is important for this audience. So this is not in my paper, so I don't expect you to discuss. But I think what we do, and I think is useful for research, is that in this staff discussion note, we look at the preparedness of countries to the artificial intelligence, and we build a new index. And this new index looks to 4 aspects that are key for a country to adopt AI. One is the digital infrastructure, whether how many people have access to the internet, the cost of internet. The second one looks at innovation and economic integration, how much a country has to spend in R&D, and also how connected it is with global trade and open it is. Third, they look at the human capital. So what is the share of workers with tertiary education, share of work in STEMs, and the fourth, in regulation and ethics. And what we find is that across countries, as one would expect, advanced economies are much better prepared to benefit from artificial intelligence, while many EMs in low-income countries still have to invest a lot in infrastructure and in human capital. So that's a little bit the policy message that we have, that in many developed economies in low-income countries, governments need to really to step up to be able to benefit from AI. And of course, because AI may increase inequality within countries, it's important as well to make sure that workers have access to training, retraining, and also social policies that can mitigate some of this negative impact. Okay, thank you.
So, yeah, there's a lot that I like about this paper. It's very clear, it's very well written, it's very intuitive, and the argument is very well framed. It's obviously, it makes a number of contributions to the existing literature, one of which is primarily because the existing literature is so small. So although descriptive in nature, it provides, at least in my opinion, a very much needed and descriptive foundation of the profile of variation in exposure to AI in various labor markets across the development spectrum. And in addition to doing that, it provides a well-argued extension. As you see, the few existing studies that have looked at how AI exposure varies across labor market groups, they don't say, okay, well, is this good or bad? Is AI more of a substitute or a complement to these jobs that face high exposure? Which is obviously a key concern in the technology and labor market literature on the effects of automation on job displacement and the task content of employment, etc. So this is a very key extension that this paper makes, in my opinion, as opposed to just documenting overlap in, for instance, the tasks that AI can do that humans can also do. And in addition to that, its use of the ONET data and going beyond the task modules within the ONET data, I think is really important, given the still evident uncertainties that we have about the ability of AI, both now and going into the future. Yeah, and in the paper, the authors do a battery of robustness tests to test the sensitivity of the index to various different conditions and assumptions, which of course aid its credibility, which is always very encouraging. Yes, I mentioned the ONET thing here. What's great is that it explicitly considers inequalities throughout the paper, both within countries and between countries, which of course has strong policy implications about convergence, for instance, going forward in both the short and long runs, and of course inequalities within countries that, of course, from what I understand these days, drive global income inequality at least. So its relevance is very clear and upfront in the paper. So I like that a lot. Some comments and suggestions. So this is not my bit of a scapegoat, I guess, not my field of expertise. So hopefully this is just my 2 cents. Hopefully you can find some comments useful. The title of the paper is, of course, very clear and relevant and honest. There are some parts I found in the introduction that suggests that the paper seeks to focus on the effects of AI on job displacement or on labor markets. I feel like this paper is more a descriptive profile of AI exposure across labor markets, which is, of course, again, very good. And it's suggestive of effects, I think, but I think you might want to consider some revisions there. That's a very minor point, though, and probably just stylistic. A question that I had in mind while reading the paper was, okay, so the subgroup of interest here from like a policy perspective, I believe, would be jobs that face high exposure to AI and additionally low complementarity, right? The fear, of course, is displacement or job loss. I started to think in the context of African economies, for instance, and many developing country or lower income country economies, of course, many of them don't face an unemployment issue, but rather an employment issue, right, with respect to job quality and those sort of conversations and debates. So I wondered, is substitution, does it always imply displacement in the context of AI? Or might it imply a reallocation, maybe not towards higher quality jobs, but a sort of recharacterization of existing jobs? That's an open-ended question. Certainly something you'd be able to speak about more of than I can. But I think it might be interesting to include a discussion on that in the paper, especially when talking about the relevance of this to developing country economies. The data, yes. So you create the index using, of course, a combination of household survey data and the ONET. These household surveys, in many cases, don't have task content, etc. Modules in them. So hence, often in the literature on automation and whatnot, we need to apply ONET to non-US contexts, which has explicit assumptions, which I'm sure you know has limitations. We're basically assuming occupations a given occupation in the US is the same in South Africa, for instance, which is a strong assumption. And I know there's very little you can do about that. There's some work by Piotr Lewandowski and colleagues based in Poland who do a lot of work, not on AI, I believe, but on automation. And they seek to use a sort of regression-based approach to predict vulnerability to automation. And they compare it to the ONET, and they show some quite startling results of how, not in all contexts, but in some contexts, what the ONET implies versus what their approach implies is very different, which is a little worrying. So I'd consider checking that out and maybe seeing if you can do something there. But if not, maybe just mentioning in the paper and being more upfront about the limitations of applying ONET to these contexts. In the paper, I may have missed it, but I couldn't find much justification for the inclusion of these specific 6 countries. I know you noted here in the presentation that you needed countries that had good quality microdata, which is, of course, a fair enough justification. Maybe consider just including that in the paper if it's not there already. And what are the consequences for focusing on these 6 countries as a sort of beginning profile of emerging market economies and advanced economies for external validity for going forward? Do we have reason to believe that these general patterns may not hold for other countries within those groups? I don't know. Yeah. And then I won't go into this in detail, but as I discussed in my presentation, so the labor market data, the earnings data for South Africa comes from the labor market dynamics in South Africa, which is from the quarterly labor force survey. It's odd that they release them as a different series or publication, but it's the same data. But of course, it includes all those problems that I mentioned before. So you might consider including a footnote or something saying, yeah. Okay, yeah, that's great. Okay, cool. Other than that, fantastic paper. Really enjoyed it. I have a couple ideas for extensions that we can chat about later if you're interested. Thanks.
Maybe someone also has questions? Oh, okay. Yes, please. Yeah.
Hello again, thank you very much. I was just wondering, so one of the indexes that you compute is the extent to which it's acceptable to see somebody doing the occupation being replaced. To what extent is that short-term or long-term? Because I remember, for example, in France, at first to have a cashier at a store being a machine was very not acceptable, and now it's very common. So.
Yeah, so that, okay. Does anyone, okay. So we are kind of running out of time. I'm happy to chat, and I'm sure that my colleagues from the session is also happy to chat after. But yeah, so this question also comes from the degree of I think it's a very similar question. Whether first, I think we see this more like a short-term, medium-term analysis from the next 5 years, I would say. But one thing that is important is also that this social context may change, right? I feel that, for example, in countries that are poor, that have a poor health system, that access to doctors is very difficult, they're maybe more welcome to use a kind of chatbot or some support for artificial intelligence to get the diagnosis, and someone in advanced economy is much less likely to do that. So I think this is an important caveat from the analysis, and which also touch a little bit on the question whether should we be applying ONAT, which document the use of tasks and occupations through the survey in the US to other countries. And so our answer is that at this stage, this is the best that we can do it. We agree that there are limitations, and we are discussing exactly right now how to overcome them. But yeah, that's also criticism for everybody that is routine jobs, so this criticism goes for a long term. Now, also, I agree that it's a quick question is whether, like when we say these occupations are more at risk, is that we see that they have a lot of tasks that are exposed to AI, but from our complementarity index, there are not many factors that are shielding them. So we see that these occupations are going to be more transformed. Now, we're not in the position to say whether they're going to be displaced or whether the tasks that are going to be doing are going to change dramatically. And I agree that the relocation of these workers can be very different depending on the country where they work and the availability of other jobs, but also on government policies, right? If government policies can support the relocation of the workers or not. And that's something that we're started to, as well, studying right now, to try to understand what are the right policies that should be in place. But I just want to thank everybody to come to our session. It was a great session. Last day, morning, but very energetic. And thank you very much.